As season 3 of White Lotus quickly comes to an end, I've been doing a lot of thinking about queer plotlines, and before the finale, I wanted to take a trip back to season 1, the dawn of the messy gay. Debuted just 1 year into the pandemic, season 1 of White Lotus offered tropical escapism in a very dark time. It gave viewers the fantasy of high-end travel at a time when we were all stuck at home. On top of that, it gave us some, let's say, less than well-realized critiques of colonialism in Hawaii. Basically, it had something for everyone. And of course, it gave drama. And, much to my delight, it also had messy gays. But despite being popular in season 1, White Lotus hadn't quite bloomed into the cultural phenomenon that we know it as today. But before we get to that, let's take a little step back and get a little feel for the resort. To me, no matter the topic covered, the brilliance of the show has always been to introduce complex stories on top of an otherwise banal telenovela-style murder mystery plot. That is, the show uses the familiarity of the murder mystery plot to allow breathing room to explore the complex characters at the heart of the stories. The White Lotus always begins each season with the reveal that at least one character will end up dead. This narrative choice orients audiences not to the question of will someone die, but rather who dies, who did it, and why did they do it. That why part in particular really drives the characterization. Why did one of these characters decide to kill another character? And associated questions like, were they justified? Do we agree with that character? What changed over the season? And my personal favorite, why did the show choose to have one character kill another character? That is, what is the broader theme that's trying to be conveyed by the murderer and the victim? I don't know about you, but I just love characterization. Give me a show any day where nothing really happens, but the characters are just spot on and complex and interesting. I mean, the best shows, of course, combine both, but to me, characterization's always been the burger, and the plot's always just been kind of the fries on the side. By using an exposition which lends itself to the audience focusing on characterization rather than plot, that is, how characters change and develop over time internally, I argue that White Lotus portrays characters with a certain level of nuance, and it's a very unique level of nuance. As fans of the show are aware, the first episode or two, you're introduced to these characters who are often archetypes. The forever iconic Tanya, played by the brilliant Jennifer Coolidge, comes straight to mind here. But despite her arc as becoming a fan favorite, the first 2 episodes, she was kind of just an archetype of this like spoiled, out of touch, heiress of sorts. And I mean, she did end that way too, but we saw the layers underneath that, and that's what really drove fans to really connect and love that character. Because we're not really focused on whether or not someone's dying. Yes, we are focused on who might die, which is kind of plot based, but we're focused on like the motivation, like what is really driving someone to kill in this like otherwise idyllic paradise. But in that process of showing character motivation, we get to see the character for their messy flaws, and we begin to see them not just as a 2D archetype, but as a full 3D figure, flaws and all. This dimensionality is seldom afforded to queer characters in media history. From the queer-coded Disney villain to the gay best friend sidekick. For much of the 20th and 21st century, gay and queer characters just weren't the main story. We ranged from evil to useful. Queer characters' purpose in plot, to the extent that they actually had a place in that plot, was to further the narratives of the straight characters around them, either as an oppositional figure as a villain, or as a supporting character as a sidekick. Shows like Will and Grace, at their best, pioneered the idea that audiences should care about gay characters at all. Well, at least if that gay character had a friendship with an otherwise relatable straight character. Nevertheless, that show introduced the idea that we should care about gay characters not just because of their tragedy, not because of their deviance, and not because of their usefulness to someone else. And the purpose of Will and Jack was not just to support their straight best friends. Instead, we saw them in various episodes tackle things like relationship breakdown, feeling insecure, like normal human things. I mean, the title of the show was telling. It was Will and Grace and not Will and Jack. But hey, it was the 90s, and for the time, it was frankly revolutionary. Shows such as Queer as Folk had complex and well-developed queer characters as well, but this show was not targeted at a mainstream audience in quite the same way that Will and Grace was. Generally in the mainstream, at least for the 20th century, gay characters just were not front and center in any way. And then when they were front and center, sometime around the mid-2010s or so, we got a mixed bag of representation. As I've touched on in previous videos, the 2010s featured a lot of good gay representation. To put it as succinctly as I can, good gay representation is the idea that media should be made in part or fully with the purpose of showing gay characters in a great light as to not offend mainstream audiences and to therefore further the advocacy of queer rights in general. Now, that's a critical read of it. I also know that good gay representation is very valuable to some people. Further, a lot of this good gay media focuses on the coming out story arc, which doesn't allow for the purpose of the character to be anything more than just gay. Now, I'd argue that a lot of this type of content can be very healing for a lot of queer people, and I don't want to discount that at all. However, I think that we should be able to express ourselves just as freely as straight people. All of this is to say is that for much of mainstream media history, queer people just weren't allowed the same level of space and depth that straight people were allowed. We were cast as villains, pigeonholed as sidekicks, and then even cast as heroes, but we were seldom shown as three-dimensional. We just weren't allowed to be anti-heroes like Tony Soprano. Heck, we weren't even given the screen time. Then along came Armond from season 1 of White Lotus, the anti-hero of this story. Armond introduced mainstream audiences to a new type of gay character. Not a villain, not a sidekick, not a hero, but a complex, messy figure with parallels to anti-heroes like Tony Soprano and Walter White. And this gay character wasn't struggling with coming out. Quite the opposite. He was struggling with everything but coming out. And deliciously, we saw the facade of his perfection crumble with each episode, and we saw him spiral into a level of madness that had seldom been afforded to queer characters on a mainstream show. So you probably don't know this about me, but I used to work at a leasing office in a high-end apartment community, and I saw myself so much in the character of Armond, especially in the pandemic era, when I think we were all going a little bit just mad. And I remember watching the show and being drawn not to the fact that Armond was queer. I was drawn to the fact that he was struggling, and we were seeing a queer man struggle with something other than the fact that he was gay. But even deeper than that, I would argue that Armond was struggling with something that wasn't explicitly because he was queer, but was a symptom of the fact that he had to adapt to being a queer man in a world that's not kind to queer men. Armond represents the idea that queer men have to put up a facade in order to adapt and survive and thrive in straight society. But what happens when that facade crumbles? To be honest with you, when COVID happened and I was working tons of hours and I was really stressed getting yelled at for just dumb things like people not being able to put on their masks when they visited the leasing office, I had just about had it too. But much like Armond, what was I to do? I was great at listening to complaints and making people feel a little bit better in the end. I was good at covering inconvenient truths with polished lies and customer service pizzazz. But I was also so sick of it. And so was Armond. Armond wasn't struggling with his queerness per se. He was struggling with everything else. And that's what just made him so real and really an icon for messy queer representation. Some of the most cathartic moments in the show for me were the scenes with Armond and Shane, who is like my best case for the idea that the customer isn't always right. Interestingly, the show didn't set us up to sympathize really with Shane's point of view. They showed him as kind of an entitled brat, and although he was technically correct about the pineapple suite, it was very clear that he was taking it way too far. Other highlights of the season, particularly in the end for me, were the scenes with Dillon. Now, the whole plot line with Dillon is obviously problematic. It's obvious that this crossed more than just like a technical HR line. Like there were definitely some ethical concerns with the fact that he was abusing his position of power very directly in order to get what he wanted from a younger, attractive male staff member. And I don't endorse that behavior at all, but given the fact that we see straight men harassing women as a plotline all the time, in a way, it was actually refreshing to see gay men being shown of doing something not okay. And even though in real life that behavior is not acceptable, as I've argued in season 3, fiction deserves a special place to talk about things that make us feel uncomfortable. Even more, I think that creative license should be applied equally to straight characters and to queer ones. But historically, it hadn't. That's why Armond, to me, is like a trailblazer, not in a good way, but kind of in a good way. Like a bull in a china shop, he destroyed the facade of perfection that gay men were, up until that point, always expected to live up to. Very rarely had we seen mainstream audiences get to connect with a character so messy and complex, and sometimes unlikable. Mike White's use of Shane as a foil here was really expertly done, because otherwise Armond might have seemed like the villain, but by making Shane so exaggeratedly loathsome, you kind of wanted to see him fail a little bit. So we have to talk about the scene of Armond in the office. Now, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but I mean, come on, it's been a few years now. Like, just watch the show. In that scene, we see Armond take a cocktail of drugs and kind of live this like Playboy style fantasy, but with a gay twist. It's not uncommon in media to see scenes of successful men or men who are spiraling indulge in illicit substances and party with a bunch of naked women. That's like the common thing that we think of when we think of The Sopranos again, where they would hang out at the Bada Bing. But here we see a gay man partying and being kind of a debaucherous buffoon, really. And that's something that's typically reserved to straight people, and particularly straight men. I'd argue that women also face a certain level of restriction from showing unrestrained, chaotic behavior. The big highlight of that scene, of course, was his interaction with Dillon, which, if you don't remember, maybe just go back and take a look at it, but I'm pretty sure you'll remember that scene because it was everywhere. I remember thinking to myself, I had not seen that particular expression of queer sexuality on a mainstream show really ever. Despite the progress that we had made in the past couple decades or so, queer sexuality has always been treated as taboo. It's always kind of that thing that you're not supposed to ask. Straight people's idea of queer sexuality is always limited to who's the top and who's the bottom, which is really code for who's the man and who's the woman in this heteronormative paradigm that I've created in my head. But here we saw a man in a position of power abusing that power, but the act itself was not in that typical heteronormative paradigm that we're so used to seeing. I don't know, y'all. Armond in season 1 was just a wild time, but he was a wild time that I love to watch. Frankly, I don't really think the show's ever topped it. So let's get to the why here. Why did Armond get killed in the end? To me, the thing that was so frustrating and also brilliant about Armand's death was the fact that it wasn't glamorous in the least bit. And actually, it was so pedestrian in the grand scheme of things. We saw the story of a very sad gay man in the midst of addiction and in the midst of a mental health crisis make some very poor decisions. He didn't get fired for those decisions. He didn't get into a severe argument with Shane like we had been hoping all along. Instead, he just gets accidentally killed, discarded kind of like a piece of trash. That was devastating. It was such an undignified way to go. The queer character dies and the straight character gets to just move on with his life like nothing had ever happened. At the end of the day, the wealthy, white, oblivious, masculine man wins out. If that's not a parallel for real life, I don't know what is. Armond, the one who had worked hard and struggled to hold up a facade for so long, lost. Shane gets to fly back home. Armond never gets to leave. Armond wasn't a hero. He wasn't a villain. He was something else. He was a deeply flawed person, but a full person who for one brief unhinged moment got to live outside of the constraints put around him. And the punishment for doing so, according to the show, was death. I don't think that death was a penalty here to show a form of moral righteousness, but rather to show a hard reality. At the end of the day, queer people just aren't quite allowed to step outside of the roles assigned to them. That's what Armand's character represents. But boy, did he try his best to break out of that role. And I think in doing so, in a very cheesy way, his legacy has lived on. If you look now to season 3, I think that Armand really set the tone for queer representation in White Lotus. He wasn't there to be palatable. Like many of the other people at the resorts, he at times could be good, at times he could be complicated, at times he was imperfect, and at times he was awful. We're used to that with the wealthy, straight hotel guests, but with the more working class queer character, we're not used to that level of breadth and that level of complexity to be allowed to be shown. And for that, I salute you, Armand.